Star Trek isn't usually thought of as a very romantic show. With good reason. Romance plots haven't been featured all that often. Several attempts at turning up the sex appeal in Star Trek projects have produced notoriously cringy results. Hello, Enterprise Massage Chamber. Hello, women in the Kelvin timeline, randomly stripping down to their undies. And many of the most devoted fans of the franchise are inexperienced in matters of romance, having never felt a loving touch from anyone but themselves. But that doesn't mean Star Trek, through the many different forms it has taken these past several decades, is devoid of non-cringe inducing sexiness. I made a whole video about how horny the franchise has always been, nor is it lacking in romance. While romance plots have never been a main focus of any Star Trek series, they aren't exactly rare. In fact, there are quite a few notable romances in Star Trek. Almost every show in the franchise has had memorable love stories. Some that lasted only for one episode, others that were told over the course of many episodes across many years. Stories that made us happy, gave us hope, and sometimes broke our hearts. That's not a wormhole up ahead. That's the tunnel of love we're about to take a ride through to explore the question, what is actually Star Trek's greatest love story? And also probably some over-the-clothes stuff, if you're up for that. You know who I bet would be up for it? This guy, Captain Kirk. His popular reputation as a skirt chaser is somewhat exaggerated, but he still got around plenty in his day. And yet, among all those flirtations and flings, only a handful of Kirk's relationships stand out as truly great love stories. One of the greatest is also the most tragic, the story of Kirk and Edith Keeler from The City on the Edge of Forever. Think of it. You meet the ideal partner, someone who floors you the moment you first set eyes on them, someone you admire not just for their physical attractiveness, but for their character, for who they are. Someone who gets you, who's fun to be with, who makes you feel good, and who makes you want to be better. It's a whirlwind romance, sure, but it's also deep and meaningful, perfect love. Everything's going great until your best friend tells you that you have to let your sweetheart get pancaked by a truck so that history can resume its proper course. I mean, it's happened to all of us at one time or another, I'm sure. Kirk and Edith meet when Kirk and Spock take an unscheduled trip back in time to New York City in the 1930s in order to stop Dr. McCoy from accidentally altering the timeline so that the Nazis win World War II and Starfleet never exists. During the ensuing 6 decades of Star Trek, we will learn that this sort of thing happens all the time. But it doesn't always include a doomed romance. Kirk and Edith Keeler's love story is one of the best known in all of Star Trek, but does that make it one of the greatest? Your mileage may vary, of course, but personally, I'm not too sure. I love the episode. The City on the Edge of Forever is rightly considered one of the best, if not the very best, of classic Trek episodes. But Kirk and Edith is a great love story more for what it represents than for what it actually is on screen. William Shatner and Joan Collins have great chemistry, and I totally buy that these two people are in love when I watch the episode. But the heart of the story doesn't lie between Kirk and Edith, it lies with Kirk. And Edith winds up mostly being an accessory. She seems great, but she's there so that Kirk can fall in love with her and then be forced to make his wrenching choice and ultimately lose her. At the moment of truth, Kirk can either save the life of the woman he loves, or more precisely, allow Dr. McCoy to save her, or he can allow her to die, knowing that her death is necessary to put history back on track. He makes the selfless choice, the heroic choice, the choice that saves millions of lives and preserves the future he knows, but costs him his love. It's one of Kirk's finest moments, and some of Shatner's best acting of the series. However, like I said, I think it works more because of the idea of the thing. Hero makes devastating personal sacrifice for the greater good than because of the thing itself. There's a fascinating twist on this story in Harlan Ellison's original screenplay. In that version, Kirk doesn't stop the other character from rushing into the street to save Edith from the truck. He starts to, he reaches out, but he stops short. Spock has to step in and ensure that Edith is hit by the truck. In the moment of truth, Kirk just can't do it. Even if it means the future he comes from is lost. He loves her too much. Is it the right thing to do? Given what's at stake, no, I don't think it is the right thing to do. Is it the heroic thing? No. But it's goddamn human, isn't it? Even Spock can't be mad at him for it. Ellison's screenplay ends with a shaken Kirk back on the Enterprise talking privately with Spock. I loved her, Kirk says. And Spock replies, no woman was ever loved as much, Jim. Because no woman was ever offered the universe for love. Well said, Spock. Like Shakespeare and shit. Spock-spear? Shake Spock? I'll work on it. Hey, Spock, come back. While I've got you here, there's another tragic romance from Star Trek the original series, and it involves Spock. No, not the one where his girlfriend orchestrates a fight to the death between Spock and Kirk as part of an elaborate scheme to break up with him. I'm talking about the one where we find out that Spock is allergic to sneezing space flowers, and one of the symptoms is love. It all happens in the episode This Side of Paradise. The Enterprise shows up at a colony for what they anticipate will be a grim duty, surveying the destruction caused by a lethal radiation exposure. But when the landing party beams down, they discover to their amazement that, actually, everything seems fine. Better than fine. These people who were supposed to be dead are alive and thriving. And one of them is a familiar face to Spock. That's Layla, a botanist at the colony. She knew Spock 6 years ago on Earth. She loved him then, but he never expressed any feelings for her due to his unemotional Vulcan ways. Now that he's here, though, Layla knows how to fix that. She takes Spock for a walk in a field around the colony and says, hey, check out this cool flower. Its spores give us life and peace and happiness. Spock's like, yeah, right. And then the flower sneezes in his face and gives him a terrible headache for a few seconds. Then he looks up like, hey, Layla, I love you. It turns out all of the colonists have been exposed to spores from these flowers, and the spores not only allow them to survive in an environment saturated with radiation that would normally be lethal to them, the spores also keep the colonists in perfect health and bestow upon them a serene disposition. Spock immediately decides to hell with this Starfleet thing and begins spending all his time with Layla, doing normal grown-up romantic stuff like watching clouds and climbing trees together. As an avid tree climber myself, I get it. Eventually, the spores infect other Enterprise crew members and spread to the ship, and before Captain Kirk realizes what's happening, the entire crew has decided to quit and move down to the colony. Realizing how bad this will look on his record, Kirk is determined to do something about this. He figures out that intense emotions like anger will break the hold of the spores, so he convinces Spock to beam back up to the Enterprise one last time and snaps him back to himself by bullying him with racist insults and brawling around the transporter room a bit. Once Spock is no longer under the influence of the spores, he helps Kirk come up with a plan to free the rest of the crew. Before they carry out their plan, which involves transmitting a subsonic signal to everyone's communicators that will also disrupt the influence of the spores, Spock beams Layla up to the Enterprise. She realizes that Spock is no longer with us, as she puts it. Layla tearfully begs him to come back to the planet with her, to take another face full of spores, to stay with her so they can be happy. I love you, she tells him. I loved you 6 years ago. Here, you can love me too. Spock tells her he can't stay. He has a responsibility to the Enterprise, to Captain Kirk. More than that, he is who he is. If there are self-made purgatories, Spock says, then we all have to live in them. Mine can be no worse than someone else's. Layla cries, not only for Spock, but for herself. The profound sadness of losing him again has shaken off the influence of the spores on her. But she still loves Spock. That wasn't the spores. That was real. At the end of the episode, with everyone back to normal and the Enterprise preparing to transport the colonists away to someplace safer with less lethal radiation and presumably fewer plants that jizz mind altering spores into your face, Kirk notices that Spock has been quiet for a while. He asks Spock what's on his mind, and Spock replies, "I have little to say, Captain, except that for the first time in my life, I was happy." Another love story that ends in sadness because the lovers are forced to separate so the hero can fulfill his duty to serve a higher cause. I wonder if that's going to be a pattern. Actually, it's not, really. But a bunch of these are going to have unhappy endings, just so you know. The story of Spock and Layla, like the story of Kirk and Edith, is well told and packs an emotional punch. But it's also difficult to root for Spock and Layla as a couple under the circumstances presented in the episode. The colonists do seem happy and healthy and generally content with life when the Enterprise shows up, but they're also kinda in a cult. There's no cult leader or anything, but they are under the influence of these spores, an influence that seems benign, but there's always something at least implicitly sinister about anything that's capable of flipping a switch and instantly resetting someone's personality. Layla and Spock seem happy, but in order to stay happy, Spock has to join the cult. So while the ending is definitely sad, it's not all that sad because are we really upset that Spock didn't join a spore-splooging flower cult? Having said that, it is a genuinely sad ending. Even though the spores have mind-altering properties, the idea is that the spores allow Spock to express the love for Layla that he already feels but suppresses because of his Vulcan nature. Their love is genuine, but destined to be fleeting. That idea is contrasted against the idea that even though his feelings for Layla are real, and even though some part of him may wish he could be the person he briefly is at the colony with her, that's not who Spock really is. I love you, I want to be with you, but I am what I am. Didn't seem to slow down Popeye, but Spock's a different case, I guess. I'm not going to discuss or even mention every single romantic couple we ever see in a Star Trek show, but since I'm talking about Spock and Vulcan-human relationships, I should probably acknowledge Spock's parents, Sarek and Amanda. It adds an extra layer of tragedy to Spock's relationship with Layla when you remember that his own parents are a Vulcan-human pair, and they're... well, I don't know if happy is the right way to describe it, but they seem like they've made it work on some level. Or maybe not, and that's why Spock has such rotten luck with the human babes. Bad role models. Moving on to Star Trek The Next Generation, there are a bunch of smaller romantic stories that last for single episodes, but there are two big ones that recur throughout the series. The first is the long-denied but undeniable attraction between Captain Picard and Dr. Beverly Crusher. Picard and Crusher have a history that is first referenced in TNG's premiere, Encounter at Farpoint, and is fleshed out here and there in subsequent episodes. Crusher's husband, Jack, was Picard's best friend. Jack was killed while serving under Picard's command. Despite this, Beverly didn't seem to harbor any resentment toward Picard over Jack's death, and when she came aboard the Enterprise as chief medical officer, Dr. Crusher and Picard were close friends. In fact, Crusher was Picard's closest confidant on the ship. They hung out a lot during their off-duty hours, they regularly had breakfast together, and Picard became a mentor, surrogate father to Crusher's son Wesley. Though their relationship on TNG is mostly platonic, there's a will they or won't they sexual tension between them that is never far from the surface. It comes to the foreground a few times, notably during the first season episode, The Naked Now, when they both get space drunk and are barely able to restrain themselves from tearing off their uniforms and defiling every surface in Picard's aptly named Ready Room, and the seventh season episode, Attached, when they're temporarily able to read each other's thoughts, and Crusher discovers that Picard has secretly been in love with her for many years. It's also revealed in the series finale, All Good Things, in the scenes set decades in the future, that Picard and Crusher eventually got married and then divorced. That future never actually happened thanks to the events of the episode, but when the TNG cast reunited for the third season of Star Trek Picard a few years ago, it turned out that basically that's what happened anyway. Picard and Crusher never got married, but apparently their will they or won't they relationship went through a few they will phases during the 20 or so years we weren't paying attention, including one such phase that resulted in Picard and Crusher having a son together, whom Beverly named Jack, after her dead husband, because I guess she was a little salty about that after all. Given the prominence of both characters, I couldn't possibly have made this video without mentioning it, but is the tale of Captain Picard and Dr. Crusher a great love story? I don't know. Their relationship is one of the best parts of TNG, and even though their story in Star Trek Picard Season 3 isn't what I would call compelling drama, I guess it's nice that they finally sort of wind up together. Ultimately, I'm mostly indifferent to it, despite the fact that I love both characters. The other important romance from TNG, and just a few years ago I would never have expected to hear myself say this, is a lot more compelling and satisfying as a story. I'm talking about Commander Riker and Counselor Troi, a love story with so many ups and downs and false finishes and bad decisions in story and real world, and yet somehow, improbably, it all works out pretty good. Like Picard and Crusher, we learn in the first episode of TNG that Riker and Troi have a history. They were a couple years ago. They were separated. Riker chose to focus on his career because he was all about Starfleet, baby. Then they meet again on the Enterprise, where, like Picard and Crusher, they become close friends and mostly keep things platonic. There are hints throughout the series that they might rekindle the old spark, a smooch here and there, a planned romantic vacation together, but they don't actually become a couple again until the TNG crew makes the jump from TV to the movies. It's at this point that the Riker-Troi love story loses me. In the movie Star Trek Insurrection, regarding which I'm in the minority because I really like that movie, Riker and Troi find themselves affected by the rejuvenating energy of the planet Baku and start fooling around together again. It's a sweet, fun subplot with the possibility at the end of their relationship remaining romantic in the future. Then comes Star Trek Nemesis a few years later, and all of a sudden, not only are Riker and Troi a romantic couple, they're married. It not only feels abrupt, it feels lazy. The Star Trek franchise in general was running on fumes at that point, and Nemesis was produced with the idea being that it would probably be the last movie to feature the TNG characters. So it's the send-off for the TNG crew. What should we do with Riker and Troi? I don't know, have them get married, I guess? Fuck it. That's how it feels. Then, incredibly, impossibly, Riker and Troi return for Star Trek Picard, and their relationship gets compelling again? We see them for one episode in the first season of the Picard series, living together as a married couple with a daughter. We learn they also had a son who tragically died a few years before. Then they return with more substantial roles in season 3 of Picard, and at first their relationship is going through a rough patch, but they find their way through that and wind up more in love and devoted to one another than ever. And it works really, really well. I am also in the minority about Picard Season 3. I think it's mostly terrible. But the Riker and Troi stuff is consistently some of the best material in the show. Even when everything else is awful, pandering, subpar fanfic bullshit, which accounts for the vast majority of the season. Riker and Troi seem like real people who have lived a real life together, and who have a real, true, deeply moving love for one another. To a lot of fans, Riker and Troi's long, meandering, ultimately satisfying journey together might be Star Trek's greatest love story, but we've got some ground to cover yet. There were quite a few notable couples on TNG's spin-off series, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. In fact, if you're one of those romantically minded Trekkies out there, DS9 should probably be your favorite show in the franchise, because during its 7 seasons, love was most definitely in the air. It's the only Star Trek show where 3 series regulars get married, 2 of them to each other. In addition to that, there's another wedding between 2 important recurring characters, and another series regular and recurring character are already married when the series begins. Those couples are Ben Sisko and Cassidy Yates, Worf and Jadzia Dax, Rom and Lita, and Miles and Keiko O'Brien. And the incredible thing is, despite the constant tension and tumult and interpersonal conflict on DS9, all of those couples are relatively happy while they last. Too soon? Miles and Keiko are sometimes described as having a bad marriage, but if you actually watch the show, and you've ever been in a serious relationship yourself, you might agree with me that actually their marriage is pretty good. They love each other, they seem happy. Sure, there are some ups and downs. Not every day is a good day, but what else would you expect? They live on a space station that sits between a war-torn planet, a fascist empire, and a wormhole that leads to a region on the far side of the galaxy ruled by another fascist empire. And worst of all, they've got kids. And there are so many couples beyond those I've just mentioned whose stories make for gripping, can't-miss television, like Kira and Bareil. Just kidding. Or Kira and Shakar. Just kidding. Or Kira and Odo. I actually like that one. You leave Kira and Odo alone. It took them so long to finally get together, and they deserve to be happy, and they didn't get the chance because Odo had to leave, and you just shut your goddamn mouth about Kira and Odo. You shut up! I thought the Ben and Cassidy relationship was good because it allowed the show to explore a side of the lead protagonist we hadn't really seen in a Star Trek series before. And Rom and Lita were funny and adorable as a couple because, well, Rom and Lita were funny and adorable on their own too. But if I had to pick a favorite couple on DS9, it's definitely Worf and Jadzia. Their love story is one of the few romance plots, including 2 regulars from a long-running series being paired off together, that not only works, it develops both characters in interesting ways. They don't just get together and live happily ever after, nor are the challenges they face phony and contrived. Worf and Jadzia are 2 very strong-willed characters. They have things in common, and they share a mutual attraction and love for each other, but they're also different in a lot of ways. And the writers of Deep Space Nine allow us to see those differences clashing in some really compelling ways that drive stories. And like several other Star Trek romances I've mentioned and will mention, Worf and Jadzia's story ends in tragedy, when Jadzia is killed by Gul Dukat at the end of Season 6. It's not a great ending. Sad, sure, Jadzia dies and Worf and the others are left to grieve her loss, but also abrupt and unsatisfying. It's even more unsatisfying if you know about the behind-the-scenes trouble that led up to the death of Dax, with Terry Farrell feeling disrespected by the producers of the show when it came time to renegotiate her contract, and eventually deciding reluctantly to leave the show, while also hoping that they wouldn't kill her character off so she could come back at some point. Farrell's exit from the show and the killing off of Jadzia to account for her absence going forward didn't make anyone happy. Not the cast, not the writers, not the producers, and not the audience. And it leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths to this day. Worf and Jadzia deserved a different ending. Not necessarily a happy one, but at least a better one. Because apart from that ending, Worf and Jadzia's story absolutely ranks among Star Trek's greatest love stories. You're free to disagree, of course, but speaking for myself, the romantic pickings get pretty slim for a while after the end of Deep Space Nine. What have you got on Voyager? Tom and B'Elanna? I guess? At least it represents some character growth, which is a relative rarity on Voyager, but the producers couldn't even have them get married without screwing it up. We saw duplicates of Tom and B'Elanna get married first, so when the time came for the real Tom and B'Elanna to tie the knot, the producers didn't want to repeat themselves, so they just had these 2 series regulars whose relationship had been developing over the course of years of the show at this point get married off screen. Who else? No. On Enterprise, Same sort of deal. Trip and T'Pol circle each other for a while before finally getting together, and that relationship does wind up being important for each of them and for the series, but am I ever really invested in it? Do I ever really care? Not so much. Again, your mileage may vary, and that's fine, but for me, if I want to find further possibilities for Star Trek's greatest love stories, I've got to move on. Kelvin Timeline films, Spock and Uhura are fine together. It's a twist on the classic Trek versions of the characters, who flirted a bit early on but never actually were a thing. I have no objections to the Kelvin versions of Spock and Uhura doing it Sailot style, but just like with Tom and B'Elanna and T'Pol and Trip, am I actually invested? Nah. Discovery? Oh, hell yeah, now we're talking. Not only is Disco full of characters getting into and out of romantic relationships, it's the first Trek series to prominently feature queer characters. But before I talk about some of those, I don't want to overlook the heteros. My fellow straights have their fun too. Saru's late series courtship and eventual marriage to Tarina, the president of Volculus, is sweet and endearing. After a snooze fest of a relationship with Ash Tyler, series lead protagonist Michael Burnham hooks up with Cleveland Booker after arriving in the 32nd century, and Burnham and Book's relationship is one of my favorite parts of Discovery's last few seasons. Book is wonderfully charming and likable in his own right, and he often brings out the best in Burnham, who, despite being the show's central character, can be frustratingly difficult to get a handle on. Book gives Burnham a center she can come back to, and together they helped to give the series a much-needed emotional center as it wound toward its conclusion. When the subject is Star Trek's greatest love story, I think Burnham and Book belong in the conversation. But I think the best love story told during Discovery is the one about jerk-ass genius Paul Stamets and his impossibly patient and empathetic husband, Dr. Hugh Culber. Stamets and Culber will always have a place in Star Trek history as the franchise's first gay series regulars, but their story has value far beyond what they represent. When we meet them in Season 1, they seem happy, or at least stable. Stamets seems distracted by his job developing the ship's experimental spore drive, but the spore drive is his life's work, and plus that's just Stamets. He's an always distracted, always thinking, always overthinking kind of dude. Then, later in Season 1, things take a turn when Culber is murdered. Murdered by Burnham's shitty boyfriend Ash Tyler. Not only is he boring, he's a killer. He's bad news, Michael. You can and will do so much better. Anyway, at the time of the episode's original release, Culber's death was the cause of negative reactions ranging from outrage to disgruntled sighs. Discovery is an uneven series all the way through, but its first season is particularly rocky, and the killing of Culber was a source of great frustration for many in the audience. And I'm not talking about the haters and the grifters who just reflexively pissed all over everything. I mean those of us who were actually watching the show and giving it a chance and judging it on its own merits. Finally having openly queer characters on a Star Trek show was cool. And Culber seemed like he had potential as a character, and his dynamic with Stamets was interesting, and then they knocked him off before the first season was even over. It felt like, even as they were taking a long overdue step forward, this new generation of Star Trek creators couldn't escape the mistakes of the past. What was with this bury your gaze bullshit? The producers of Discovery were listening, and they decided to make a creative course correction in Season 2, and that correction became one of the very rare examples of creators allowing the audience to directly influence the content of the show that actually worked. Normally, I don't think TV and film creators should be paying very close attention to the audience. They should focus on making the show they want to make and trusting that if the show is good, it will find an audience that appreciates it. But in this case, what the producers of Discovery did in response to the negative audience reaction to Culber's death turned out for the best for everyone. In Season 2, Culber is resurrected. He's found to still be alive in the mycelial network, the space mushroom domain through which the spore drive allows the USS Discovery to travel. The space mushrooms regard Culber as an invader to their realm and have been attacking him the entire time between his death and when Culber and others from Discovery find him. So Culber's been having a bad time in general. His experiences in the mycelial network, plus the whole back from the dead thing, leave him feeling profoundly alienated from his life. He goes back to work pretty soon after his resurrection, but he separates from Stamets and considers transferring off of Discovery. Another Star Trek love story with an unhappy ending? Not this time. When Stamets is seriously injured during Discovery's big season-ending battle with the forces controlled by the evil AI called, Control, Culber realizes that he belongs by Stamets' side, and they are together as Discovery makes its jump into the far future at the end of Season 2. It's a lovely full-circle moment for Stamets and Culber. Separated by the death of Culber, finally brought back together following the serious injury of Stamets. Solid storytelling, but not a good example to emulate if you feel like your own relationship needs fixing. Don't hurt yourself or your partner in an attempt to bring the two of you closer together. I'm not a therapist or a couples counselor or anything like that, but I do know that orchestrating shared trauma is not the path to a better relationship. But if you insist on trying something like that, at least leave violence out of it and subject yourselves to a lesser trauma, something miserable but less likely to leave permanent physical and psychological scars. Like taking a cruise. I'm kidding. Don't ever take a cruise. Anyway, after Stamets and Culber arrive in the 32nd century at the beginning of Discovery's third season, they not only stay together, they become the parents of a surrogate family when they meet the other important queer characters in the series, Adira and Gray, who are also a couple. Sort of. It's complicated. So Adira is non-binary, and their boyfriend is Gray, a trans man. Or rather, their boyfriend was Gray, because when we're introduced to Adira, Gray is dead. Only not really, because Gray was a Trill, and Adira is now the host of Gray's symbiont, which means Gray's memories are now part of Adira, but also, it's more than that, because Gray has been appearing to Adira as an independent person, kind of like a ghost that only Adira can see and hear. Star Trek is weird, y'all. That past host ghost phenomenon is not supposed to happen with Trills. Adira shares with Stamets that these Gray visitations are occurring, and Stamets believes them. Once Adira convinces everyone else that their dead boyfriend really is appearing and talking to them in disembodied form and isn't just a hallucination, they start working on a more permanent solution. It's not just the future, after all, it's the future of the future, so there are options when this sort of thing happens. With the assistance of a Trill witch doctor, Culber transfers Gray's consciousness from the symbiont hosted by Adira into a new body, one of those organic android deals, like the one they gave Jean-Luc Picard at the end of Season 1 of the Picard series. Remember when that happened? And changed nothing? And it was almost never mentioned again? Adira and Gray stay together for a bit, but they drift apart, and eventually, in Discovery's final season, they break up amicably. So, yet another notable Star Trek love story without a happy ending, but at least they both make it out alive, right? Maybe the most profound aspect of both Stamets and Culber and Adira and Gray is that their relationships are able to endure at all, given the obstacles they face. They are pushed apart by forces they can't control or understand, but they share bonds of love so unbreakable that somehow they find their way back to each other. That could be a beautiful story under any circumstances, but it's especially powerful when you consider that these are stories of queer people, two gay men and two young trans people, being told at a time when real queer people are facing real obstacles every bit as dangerous as the imagined ones faced by the heroes of Star Trek. LGBTQ people face discrimination and dehumanization from their own families and peers and from the highest levels of government, and somehow, as persecuted peoples have done throughout history. They endure, they fight on, they seek and find love, and they refuse to allow themselves to be denied or erased. I think we're coming to the end here. I haven't mentioned anything about Lower Decks yet. I think Mariner has a girlfriend at one point, right? Yeah. Good for her. Prodigy, Dahl and Gwyn have kind of an adolescent flirtation. They like each other, but do they like each other? Stop pushing. They're kids. Star Trek Picard also had Seven and Raffi, though their relationship never felt like more than a tacked-on afterthought to me, unfortunately. On Strange New Worlds, there's kind of an unrequited love thing happening with La'an and Kirk that I'm digging, and a star-crossed lovers bit with Spock and Chapel that I'm also digging, and there's Spock and his fiancée T'Pring, a relationship that has been central to so far 2 absolutely delightful comedic episodes, so I'm digging that too. Plus, because Strange New Worlds is a prequel to the original series, we know Spock and T'Pring are destined for that fight to the death with Captain Kirk breakup I referenced before, which I just dig so much, you all. Oh yeah, and Captain Pike and Captain Batel. I love those two. For you future viewers, I'm making this video before the release of the 3rd season of Strange New Worlds, so I don't yet know if Batel gets eaten alive from the inside out by the Gorn babies with which she's been implanted. I hope not, though. I like her. And she and Pike make such a cute couple. If she survives, I bet they could be very happy together for a few years. There are many more couples and romantic stories from across the Star Trek franchise that I haven't mentioned, as well as those I've only lightly touched on, so if one of your favorites is one of those, please share in the comments, because the truth is, the question in the title of this video is a rhetorical one. There is no definitive answer. What is actually Star Trek's greatest love story? That's up to you to answer as much as it's up to me. Stamets and Culber, Kirk and Edith, Worf and Jadzia, all respectable choices in my book. Maybe you're more of an out-of-the-box thinker, or just a smartass, and you'd say the greatest Star Trek love story is, Scotty and the Enterprise's engines. Also a respectable choice. The guy read technical manuals like other people look at porn, for Christ's sake. Or Dr. Crusher and Ronan, that Byronic ghost who had previously been throwing the cock to her elderly grandmother. Might seem weird to many of us, but you can't deny his smoldering sexuality. The dude had big wick energy. Maybe you'd choose the story of lovers whose relationship was never explicitly part of the show, but has been inferred by some fans, like Kirk and Spock, the ship that inspired the entire genre of slash fiction, or Dr. Bashir and Garrick, a slash fic ship so widely accepted that even the actors who played the characters have openly speculated that they must have been fucking off screen. If I absolutely had to give a specific answer to the question, I grew up watching TNG, and I was legitimately surprised and impressed by how well they were handled in the Picard series, so I'd probably say Riker and Troy. But if you're interested in this question, what's important isn't what I'd say, it's what you'd say. So ask yourself, and respond from your heart, because truly, whether we're talking about Star Trek or real life, when the question is about love, there is no wrong answer. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Auntie Kate 808. Thanks, Auntie Kate 808. Takra Dave. Thanks, Takra Dave. William Tucker. Thanks, William. Imrand. Thanks, Imrand. Ben Taylor. Thanks, Ben. David J. Beaver. Thanks, David. Anthony O'Grady. Thanks, Anthony. Jeremy Jacobs. Thanks, Jeremy. Boy and Horse. Thanks, Boy and Horse. Yara. Thanks, Yara. Space Cadet. Thanks, Space Cadet. Matt with 2 T's. Thanks, Matt with 2 T's. Zanubi R. Thanks, Zanubi. Maximilian Marks. Thanks, Maximilian. Robin Fixter Patterson. Thanks, Robin. Anne Hearn. Thanks, Anne. Joseph Canada. Thanks, Joseph. Matthew Graves. Thanks, Matthew. Jesse Hallett. Thanks, Jesse. And now for the new channel members. They are Aaron Kenny. Thanks, Aaron. Barrington. Thanks, Barrington. Rich Lord. Thanks, Rich. Ian. Thanks, Ian. Richard Wayne. Thanks, Richard. Terry Burgess. Thanks, Terry. 1807P. Thanks, 1807P. Marcus. Thanks, Marcus. Mysteriously Unnamed. Thanks, Mysteriously Unnamed. Quorum of One. Thanks, Quorum of One. Ed Zoller. Thanks, Ed. Chris Seabrook. Thanks, Chris. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding, Dana Cole, and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, I don't regard myself as an unorthodox thinker. Most of my takes pertaining to Star Trek and also topics beyond are pretty middle of the road, opinions that might not be unanimously agreed upon, but that are shared by many people. But next month's Trek Actually video will not fall into that category. Oh no, for I will bravely step outside the popular consensus within Star Trek fandom and argue for a proposition that is most controversial indeed, and I will do so by asking a single provocative question. Is Star Trek TNG's second season actually better than you think? Don't be afraid. Sometimes the only proper thing to do with popular opinion is to give it this here. In an articulate and thoughtful way, I mean. That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.